My name is Balkan Devlen. I'm the director of the Transatlantic program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and thank you very much coming to this event that is co-organized by Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office as a part of our project Double Trouble, in which we explore the implications of Russia and China and their growing and getting closer access for Canada, for our allies and partners across the world. In this particular event, we especially want to focus on the supply chains and the Arctic, both in terms of security, but also when it comes to dealing with the economic security and the supply chains more broadly. We do have an excellent panel here today. I will be primarily moderating. We have Heather Exner-Pirot, who is a senior fellow and the director of the Natural Resources, Energy and Environment program. So I have Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who is the director of the National Security, Foreign Affairs and National Defense at MLI. And last but not least, we have Rob Huebert, who is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a professor at University of Calgary. I'd like to thank once again, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for their support and Jerry Piroti for his support in organizing the event here. Before we start the panel, we do also have a brief welcome message from Member of Parliament from Calgary Heritage, Shiolo Majumdar, who is not only a friend to us here at the panel, but also a former colleague at MLI, and he couldn't be here, so he wanted to send a quick welcome message, and then we will get on to the panel.
I'm jealous. You're in Calgary at the Petroleum Club with four amazing human beings, with Doctors Exner-Pirot, Rob Huebert, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and Balkan Devlen, and my old hind at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Listen, I'm a new member of Parliament from Calgary Heritage, and I'm a former colleague and present friend of the four people that you will be hearing from shortly. These thought leaders are genius in every single way. They are people who hold the light in a world of darkness as we try and navigate the challenge that China and Russia pose through their unlimited ambition. In all of these things, the Canadian interest has to be core for the road ahead. And for too long, we've seen Justin Trudeau and his post-national project undermine the idea of our own national interest. In discovering how Canadian interests are best served in this age of disruption, in discovering how we will make our contribution to the world in its energy security and Arctic security, you could not have a finer collection of people than these four friends who are gathered with you to discuss these issues today. So welcome to Calgary. Know that I'm extremely jealous and that I wish I could be there, but that in every minute of every day, I pay very close attention to what the Macdonald-Laurier Institute produces, and especially so after your conversation today. I'm looking forward to learning more about your deliberations. Have a fantastic conversation. Thanks again for doing this in the energy security capital of Canada and the world in Calgary. Thank you.
Here we go. We're back. Thank you. So I won't be doing most of the talk. We have a great panel here, so I'll just have the easy job of asking the questions. And I want to start with Jonathan first to provide a little bit of a sort of a broader, take a step back and provide a broader take on the challenge that Russia and China and their smaller minions, North Korea and Iran, causing the trouble, the upheaval, the chaos that they are causing across the world. Why do we need to care about it? How do we need to think about this particular challenge and the interconnectedness of different theaters, be it the Atlantic, the Arctic, the Indo-Pacific? Just a broader overview, Jonathan. Let me start with you then, and then we'll continue.
Thanks a lot, Balkan, and always great to follow Shuv. Shuv used to be the former foreign policy director at our institute, so we were a triple threat before we had him. Now we're double trouble. But just a couple comments here, Balkan. So first of all, from a Canadian context, I think it's important to think about, when thinking about Russia and China, Traditionally, we didn't have a serious outlook in foreign security policy on either of them in the previous years. So this is even before getting into the challenges that Russia's posing, the challenges that China's posing, both to Canada and our allies. We didn't have a serious foreign strategic policy on either of them. And actually, we still don't have a foreign policy strategic document that outlines these threats. There are some positive signs. We do have a defense policy update out. We do now have an Indo-Pacific strategy, but we haven't really outlined why these countries pose a challenge to us. The second, I think, important point is the fact that these are not isolated challenges. So one of the worries that I have, and you see this playing out not just in Canada, but amongst many of our allies, is what I call the division between the policy elites. So on one side, you see policy elites saying, we need to care about Russia. Look what Russia's doing with their unjustified reinvasion of Ukraine since 2022. And then you have the other side, and especially when you look down to our neighbor down to the south, and you would say, what is the one thing that both sides of the aisle actually agree on in Washington? It's about the challenge that China poses. Going back to double trouble and why the Macdonald-Laurier Institute thinks this is important and why we're doing this project is we want to break down those silos. We're not trying to say that Moscow and Beijing think identical on all geographies, on all issues, but I think the broader point is that this convergence, this sort of axis between the two is real. Yes, we understand that there's historic mistrust. I still myself make the joke, and it probably won't be a joke in the future, that the Chinese are going to be asking for Vladivostok back. They don't forget their history. So the idea that China and Russia don't have disputes, don't have territorial disputes, don't have, frankly, racism between the two of them, that's a legitimate argument, but it doesn't take away from the fact that there's a real convergence on a lot of fronts. And I think that the Canadian audience really needs to understand this. A few examples of this, and I'm going to take us a little bit outside of Canada first, is, of course, naturally we look at Ukraine. We see Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. China will use a word salad of many different ways to say, look, we're neutral, we're trying to intervene, and be an honest broker for a peace process, but we can see through many of the actions that they're taking and many of the materials that they're allowing into Russia that go into components of missiles, sensors, et cetera, that they are not an honest broker. We see this diplomatically. We see this through the way that they're circumventing some sanctions. We see this from the way that they're gobbling up Russian gas. Clearly, they're on the side of Moscow, and clearly this threatens not just Ukraine and its territorial integrity, but it threatens the peace and security in the transatlantic community, which Canada is a founding member of NATO. So I think that's the one that's the obvious sort of blinking light that we all see in recent years with Ukraine. The second one that I think is not as obvious, and somebody who spent a lot of my career in Asia, I think it's worth pointing out, is we sometimes forget that Russia is also a Pacific power. And Canada also sometimes forgets that we're a Pacific country. Yes, we finally now have a strategy for the quote-unquote Indo-Pacific, but what I often remind people is Vancouver is closer to Tokyo than Canberra is closer to Tokyo. So while it seems that Australia is one of the great Pacific powers now, Canada, we have equities in the Pacific. And Russia very much is using its leverage and its powers to be a disruptive player in the Indo-Pacific as well. So it may not get the attention the headlines that we see in Ukraine, but just a few examples of this. And the most jarring one, of course, that we see now, Balkan, and this sort of goes to your point about the others, the quote-unquote minions. And we have this sort of acronym now that we call the CRINCs, which is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. This is not, this was the greatest worry, I think, of a lot of Western strategists 5, 10, 15 years ago. And now we're actually seeing the fruition of this. Be it, again, in Ukraine, where now we're seeing Russian special forces on the ground in the theater, whether it's the munitions they're using. Of course, we see Iranian Shahed drones, et cetera, being used in Ukraine. The convergence backed by the double trouble. This doesn't happen without the great convergence between Russia and China. So the last thing I'll pass off before Rob and Heather can get into the Arctic as well is that this spans geographies. Of course, we see this in the Indo-Pacific, we see this in Europe, we see this in Canada, but it also spans thematic areas too. So I'm sure Heather will go into critical minerals, energy security. This goes into traditional security. We even see this in the cooperation between the sort of surveillance technologies, the information narratives, the states, the espionage side. Again, I'm not saying they're lockstep and that they don't have mistrust, but we are seeing significant convergences. While I know today we're focusing on the Arctic, one area that I find fascinating to see play out is Central Asia, as an example. This is another domain similar to the Arctic where Russia traditionally did not want to court Chinese influence and actually is very critical of Chinese investment in infrastructure. We've seen that basically turn on its head. And the reason for that is that Russia realizes that it doesn't have really any friends. And the leverage right now in this partnership is very much at the point where Russia is the junior partner and almost the baby partner. And China is absolutely the senior partner. So I think that's worrying on a lot of areas. I think it's worrying the Arctic, but again, I'll pass it over to the other my other two panelists to get into a bit more.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much, Johnson. At the Institute, we have been talking about this at least 4 or 5 years right now, and the convergence between Russia and China. And you rightly pointed out that it is not about having common interests and sharing common values with these countries, but what unites them is a lot more than what divides them. And their primary objection to the Western led international order and their desire to make the world safe for their autocratic systems is a very, very strong force when it comes to aligning these countries. And the same goes really for Iran and North Korea as well. So you don't need to be, I mean, we can get into details later on, but even with the Second World War, the Axis powers did not necessarily coordinate perfectly, right? You don't need to be perfectly aligned to cause harm and damage and undermine the peace and security. So that's something we really need to keep in mind. And of course, it is a full spectrum attack, right? It is not only the return of land war to Europe on the one hand, and it is not only the way in which China intimidates, threatens, coerces its neighbors in South China Sea and elsewhere, but it is a full spectrum attack ranging from targeting infrastructure, targeting assassinations, cutting undersea cables, stealing intellectual property, buying of resources, and. So it is important to understand that this is a full spectrum challenge. And one of the things that I think we need to be able to think about, and that's what I want to turn to you, Heather, is what Canada can do in this particular circumstances when we face this challenge of Russia and China engaging in a variety of fronts, variety of domains and sectors. What Canada can do, not only to secure ourselves and ensure our own prosperity, but what can we do as a good ally and partner to our friends and allies around the world, to the United States, to our Indo-Pacific allies, to our European allies. And one of the things, of course, you have been highlighting for years is that Canada as a natural resource power, be it energy, be it food, be it critical minerals. We have the things that makes our societies, our defense systems resilient. What role Canada can play? What can we do?
Yeah, great question. So, just to build on what Jonathan was saying, I think what we've seen is the weaponization of commodities. That's what we've seen from China and Russia in the last few years. And I would say after the Soviet Union fell apart, we really saw a huge expansion of globalization. And in terms of trade, the world was flat, and you wanted to trade with everyone. And there weren't a lot of security considerations on trade. It was really about, best value, lowest price, those kinds of things. And for the most part, that made us very prosperous. For another part, and we're starting to see kind of the political fallout, was that there was deindustrialization. There was the offshoring of manufacturing, that China sucked up a lot of that capacity and a lot of those jobs. And aside from the political implications of that, we now have defense industrial base implications of the fact that China's manufacturing manufacturing capacity has been growing while ours has been receding. Here in Canada, and just to take it back, we started to see the vulnerability of our supply chains where it became mainstream with COVID, where you had, some self-imposed restrictions on supply chains. You weren't, every time you went to the grocery store, something was out. It just, things were not normal. Things were more expensive. We had inflationary spikes, and people started to feel for the first time the supply chains that even though, your banana takes 100 steps to get to your fridge, for 80 cents, you hadn't noticed those or felt those for a lot of things. And then on top of COVID and that supply chain inflationary disruption, you had Russia invade Ukraine. And that, for me, that is the turning point. That is the 9/11, where that is the 1991 collapse. That is where we say things have changed. There will be a pre-2022 era and a post-2022 era. And everything feels a little bit like it's falling apart. And even, the chaos from Trump, a coup in South Korea, war in Israel, potential war in Taiwan, on top of Ukraine. And it feels like things will probably get worse before they get better. So what is the role for Canada in all this? And, it's bewildering. And I know I'm in a room of friendlies. Everyone in this room is probably going to agree that Canada, where we do have soft and I'd argue also hard power, is on our resources. That is what makes us powerful or important on the world stage and to our allies. And we have spent the last 10 years being embarrassed by those resources and saying things, going to Davos, their prime minister, and saying we want to be known for our resourcefulness, not our resources. Well, everyone wants to know us for our resources, and we should give it to them. And so for, again, canceling Northern Gateway is on my mind a lot this week. Canceling all those LNG projects, saying there's no business case for LNG, the Impact Assessment Act, the downward pressure that is faced on our resource sector. Now is the time where we need those resources. And even in a negotiation with our closest ally, who needs friends when you have, but even in those negotiations, you see that the leverage that we bring to that table right now is energy, and to a lesser extent critical minerals, and elsewhere with food. And so what can Canada do? And what Russia, a lot of its power is built up around its hydrocarbons, obviously oil, natural gas, and it weaponized Europe's dependence on it for natural gas. That was its opening. That's how it thought it could insulate itself from some of the pushback. And even today, there are still European, even though they've shut down pipeline gas, they still import Russian LNG. We've sanctioned some Russian oil. You cannot get all that Russian oil out of global markets. It would be too disruptive. Even Iranian oil, has not suffered too badly. Very hard to enforce those sanctions. So, and I think, this crowd in this city appreciates the hydrocarbon side, but just, to end off here, China on the critical mineral side. Again, this is new, I would say, in the last 2 or 3 years. China did do some weaponization of rare earths, and that's why, if you ever heard the term rare earths, that was wise, because China weaponized it with Japan in particular about 10 years ago. And we all started to say, whoa, wait a second, China controls, 90% of the supply is something that isn't, in everyone's pockets, and every single, defense, supply chain. Even though it's a small niche market, you need it for everything. And then you start to look at all the other ways that China was in control of critical minerals, and far exceeding, it makes oil and gas look like child's play, because every continent has a refining capacity. Every continent has production capacity. The United States is a big player. Canada's a big player. On hydrocarbons, we're actually self-sufficient in North America. But on critical minerals, no one is self-sufficient. And on critical minerals, China dominates supply chains of particular commodities in a way that no one dominates other commodities in any other way. Just yesterday in Chinese time, this morning for us, they put on additional export restrictions, for example, on gallium, germanium, antimony. These are very small niche products, and I like to say, like, a lot of these, critical minerals or rare earths that we're talking about, they're usually byproducts of things that make money. They're usually not the things that make money. And that's why in the West, we've been just perfectly fine to let China, with its cheaper labor, low environmental standards, build up that capacity. There's really only in some of these cases 2 or 3 or 4 suppliers in the world, and most of them are Chinese. But now this is looking like a mistake. And so how quickly can a country like Canada, which has all these critical minerals in partnership with, say, Norway and Australia in particular, United States, how quickly can we develop the processing capacity and get these things for ourselves, and even just to have redundancy, not even to replace China, but to not be dependent on them. And whereas 6 months ago, a year ago, we talked about critical minerals in the context of energy transition, today we talk about it in the context of the defense supply chain. And what are the dozen or 20 commodities that we need to build F-35s, to build drones, munitions, energetics, those kinds of things, and we don't have all that in the West.
No, I mean, this is an excellent point. And I want to come back to the notion later on in the second round on the need to pay the national security premium today, in the sense that if we do not start developing those redundant capacities, it will be too late when the conflict comes. And it's not really you can't buy fire insurance when your house is on fire. You need to buy it earlier, right? And I'm going to get to Rob on the security military dimension in a minute, but it's the notion that we are in the West heavily dependent on China for the production and the refining of the materials that are used to produce the munitions, that are produce the weapon systems, is mind-boggling, right? We are in a systemic competition with a country that, if they decide to cut off the supplies, and they have, and we saw the importance of mass, the importance of the producing things that actually kill people in war, right? Words are fine, cyber is okay, but if you don't have the weapons, if you don't have the ammunition, you will not be able to protect your people, your territory, your independence. And it is mind-boggling that we are dependent on the biggest rival in terms of producing the things that we need to produce to defend ourselves. On that note, I want to turn to Rob. Rob, you have been for a while the lone voice in highlighting the security military dimension of Arctic security, pointing out that we need to really think about security threats, direct security threats in the Arctic, through the Arctic, to Canada, to North America, that we need to take that into account, and this notion that it is somehow sits outside the broader geopolitical sort of competition is mistaken and misguided. Tell us a little bit more about the implications of Russia and China, particularly working together in the Arctic, in terms of the security and the defense of Canada and North America, and why do we need to be paying attention to it, and what should we do?
Well, thank you very much, Balkan. There's one advantage to being sort of the old fart amongst everybody here. My thinking in terms of what the security threat in the Arctic is that it is central. It is within the context of Western society is going to fall or be able to defend itself on its ability of ultimately how it can defend itself in the Arctic region. Now, let me be very clear about this. I'm not talking about the context of a Russian or Chinese invasion of any land territory. We are talking about a maritime and aerospace threat. And the Arctic became that central location in 1962, following the realization after the Cuban Missile Crisis of the centrality of nuclear deterrence. Going on my theme of looking at long-term impacts in history, I've contended the Cold War never really ended. And this is sort of a viewpoint that has not been widely accepted, but consider these two statistics. When we are looking at where Russia and China is today in 2024, in 1988, when Tiananmen Square was occurring and the Chinese elites made the decision that the defense of the regime was the central security requirement that they had, their defense budget was less than that of Canada. Their defense budget was $19 billion a year. Ours was about $21 billion. Think in terms of the Russians. As the Soviet Union implodes, as it is momentarily defeated in that stage of the Cold War, its GDP goes roughly to the size of the Netherlands. Still holds on to its nuclear weapons. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus all say, why do we need nuclear weapons? But Russia, despite having the GDP of the Netherlands, says, no, we're still going to contain it. And so let's start with those two factors in terms of how we understand why the centrality of the Arctic region is the critical point. We have to look at the long-term impacts and actions and policies of our two enemies. And I'm not going to waste your time by pretending they're competitors or adversaries. They're enemies. Once again, a very un-Canadian terminology, but one that if we look at actions and behavior. And so we have the momentary weakness of China and Russia in the 1988 phase. I won't say the end of the Cold War, because it's not. They never lost the intent of ultimately coming back. And so we look in terms of what was happening, in terms of where they were going, both in intent and action. And of course, what we know is that the Chinese made the decision to liberalize their economy and to build their military to challenge the United States. Again, try to think of Canada in 1988 saying, hey, you know what? We want to become a challenger to the American in military capability. But you think of the overall GDP at the time, you think of the capabilities that existed. Why couldn't we have said it if we'd had the political will? And so again, once again, we have to break ourselves out of this habit of just saying, oh, well, we just couldn't do anything. China with a 19 billion defense budget. And look at where they are now, probably about 600 billion. Now, we look at the Russians. The Russians never stopped actually recognizing the major criteria of their security was to remedy what they see as the fundamental surrendering of the Gorbachev era. Gorbachev, of course, is seen as a traitor. Gorbachev is seen as the loser of Russian greatness. And this is why Putin is able to come to power so quickly. And so don't lose sight of that. What do the Russians do with a GDP the size of the Netherlands? That then goes up roughly the same GDP as Canada. Again, put that in context. Today, I mean, you can argue who's a little bit ahead, who's not. We have roughly the same size. Now, we look in terms of the international system, and this is the other element of the theme that the Cold War never ended. The utilization of military force never stopped. Now, we say, okay, like, Heather said, things changed in 2022, and our Deputy Prime Minister said the real change. I say politely to Heather, not so politely to the Deputy Prime Minister, but that's just simply you're not paying attention to facts. Because when we look at the utilization of force, we see, first of all, from the Western perspective, following the events of 9/11, we have been continuously using military force to achieve our objectives. Even Canada, God forbid you ever say that the Afghanistan war. But we were in Afghanistan to change a government. We were in Afghanistan to achieve our objectives. Our objectives might be noble in our eyes to see the improvement of the welfare of women and children, but we were trying to change a foreign state's behavior. That's 101. What is war? You can go to Clausewitz, you can go to any of the academic literature. The Americans, of course, had Afghanistan and Iraq. They're changing government. Now, why is that important? Because while we're doing it, our enemies are watching how we do it. And again, we get into intent. What do? Are they like Ukraine? Are they like Belarus? Any of these other countries that we're part? No, they learn from what we're doing. And again, each of these weapon systems that we now say, okay, gives it China dominance, gives Russia dominance, the hypersonics, the Glide Avogards, the Poseidon missile systems, all that are key to Arctic security. Again, these aren't invented in 2022. You can trace them in the open literature to being begun in 2002, 2003, because they're watching us. They're saying, okay, how do we take on the West? Now, again, why does it come back to the Arctic? Because the Russians never stopped having as the core policy nuclear deterrence. Where is their nuclear deterrent based? Kola Peninsula. So even if Russia was to follow what Gorbachev and Yeltsin had wanted to do, which is to have a defensive regime that was pro-Western, you would still have to do that. But if you are going to become an aggressor state, you needed to protect your deterrent, which means you need to protect what's happening in the Arctic. It also means that that is where, when you have a GDP the size of Canada, that is where you're going to have your capabilities to go beyond. Now, again, understand your history of Russian military behavior. When they moved to stop the Chechens from having independence, we just said, oh, well, that's their terrorists. That's, they're not doing anything out of the ordinary, and we accepted that. But remember, from 2002 onward, Putin is engaged in, first of all, stopping the bleed of the expansion of the Russian entity. Then we move up to 2008. Again, the Georgian War is very difficult to understand, but the basic essence is that NATO had said, Georgia, maybe you want to come into NATO at 2008. And Putin's immediate reaction was, well, let's get involved and let's cripple the government of Georgia so they can't do it. Is Georgia in NATO today? No, of course not. So again, a victory for Russia. And then we go for when the Ukrainian war starts, 2014. What's the critical point of 2014? They have a change of government that wants to be pro-Western. Now, where does this then tie us? And so that's where I disagree with Heather. The war doesn't start in 2022. It starts in 2014, and it is a response to the Western abilities to get engaged in war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, where do we come into the Arctic? Well, again, think of Canada and Russia having roughly the same GDP. We have our 4 forward operating bases that are legacy elements from the Cold War, where we can operate our F-18. So we have those 4 airports, well, not airports, but capability. And we tried building one new base in Nanisivik. I say tried because we're still trying to do it. In that same time period, Russia either reactivates, builds, or extends 22 Arctic bases. The power of the Russian entity is in the Arctic. Now, they take the forces to go to Georgia, they take the land forces to go into Ukraine, but the power of the Russians to get into the international system is in aerospace and maritime, and that is Arctic. And that's why, if the Russians can be defeated in the Arctic without triggering their nuclear deterrent, that is how the West wins. If the West gets it wrong and the Russians truly feel threatened, then we're into nuclear war. And of course, if we basically surrender to the Russians, it is in the Arctic from where they expand. Now, where do we throw in the Chinese? Again, go to your history. Think in the context of 1935, the growing relationship between Italy and Germany. Think of Germany as think of Italy as what Russia is today. A power, but one that isn't anywhere near to the total power of China. China is the Nazi Germany of 1935. And so once again, we can't say that they're going to be working together, but it is going to be the Russians that will be triggering the wars. They do it every 8 years. That is the time period that they need to restructure their capability. And the Chinese follow behind that. Just as the Germans took advantage of the invasion of Ethiopia, we can expect to see the same thing in China. So, where do I end on this? Obviously, if the Russians are to be deterred from further action, if they achieve the victory that many people think that they are going to be achieving in Russia, given the statements that Trump has made, which means holding and basically keeping Ukraine out of NATO, seizing and holding onto the Crimea and eastern Ukraine. The next move is, of course, going to be either into the new NATO members, the Balkan states, or Moldavia. And that will be in about an 8-year period, in which case, if they succeed, the political will for the alliance to then ultimately stand up to the dictator will ultimately fail. The Chinese will take the opportunity at that point, once again following the way that the Germans took advantage of the Italians' attack, and they will then make their move on Taiwan. And so we can see, once again, if the Russians feel confident in the Arctic, that is where it is the critical point.
Let me add to this rosy picture two more things. One is that, as Rob rightly pointed out, as Russia's forces being decimated in Ukraine, they will increasingly rely on their strategic forces, their nuclear forces, which is stationed in the north, in Siberia and the Arctic, for power projection and political coercion. So we will see increasing reliance on the Russian leadership to use nuclear blackmail as they continue to do so, and rely for their nuclear forces for the defense of the country as well as their political interests, because their land forces and others are being decimated in Ukraine. So we will see increasing importance of the reliance on the nuclear forces. And the second component is back in 2020, I wrote a piece on Russia-China axis and how they can cooperate. And one of the things that I suggested there, one thing we need to be watching for is whether they will be cooperating in the Arctic. The other one was in the Central Asia. But the third thing I said is we should be paying attention to whether the Russians are going to provide advanced submarine technology to the Chinese. Currently, the Chinese subs are a little too loud. You can find them and hunt them and destroy them. But recent reports come in the past 6 months or so suggest that the Russians are transferring advanced technologies that actually makes Chinese submarines much more quieter. And given their next generation is going to be likely to be operational under ice as well, in the next 5 years, we are likely to see Chinese subs under ice in the Arctic. And what that means for Canadian security, what that means for North American security, now that we don't only need to deal with the Russian subs suddenly surfacing and whatnot, but also the Chinese ones, not only for war fighting, but also for surveillance, for sabotage, as we keep seeing in the Baltics and elsewhere, damaging subsea infrastructure, cables, pipelines, etc., etc. So it is going to, in that sense, get a little hotter up in the Arctic militarily soon. So on that positive note, let me get back to the panel for a quick sort of, but a chance to respond to what you heard in terms of what other panelists said, but also, if you can, touch upon the sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is the changes coming in the United States with the new Trump administration, and its protectionist policies when it comes to production, supply chains, and its strategy when it comes to dealing with China. So Heather, let me start with you, and Jonathan, and then I'll wrap up with Rob.
Perfect. First, I'll just say Rob was my PhD supervisor, and we do a lot of disagreeing with each other. So my sister might feel defensive that you keep attacking me over there, Rob, but well, I didn't say that the Ukraine war started in 2014, but I do say, and I will say it, is that certainly our thinking, our foreign policy thinking, changed in 2022. And I think for most Western countries, that's when Russia and China went from being competitors to being adversaries, and our foreign policy followed. But on the question of Trump, and I often joke, in 2016 I cried when Trump was elected, but this time around I was just so agnostic about it, and I could see why he was elected. You understand, kind of what the pushback was. And from a Canadian perspective, what did it mean? I did think we're pretty insulated because of our energy imports or exports to them. 4.3 million barrels that we send to them, natural gas, the critical minerals, all those things. And I wrote an article where I kind of go through all the things that they are dependent on. And that, and it's been our feeling, certainly at the think tank, that we don't mind if there's a little bit of push from the Trump administration to Canada to say, you guys have to spend more money on defense. We've been arguing we have to spend more money on defense. All the provinces argue you have to spend more on defense. The Business Council of Canada says you have to spend more defense. We're not going to cry if Trump says you guys have to spend more on defense. We think you should too. Where I think, is a little bit dangerous of what's happening this week and with the tariffs and the threat of tariffs. There's only so many times you can play the tariff card and get taken seriously, but I think there's probably 1 or 2 more times that he'll play it and get taken seriously. Is that, I can understand America first, but right now is not the time for America alone. That the United States needs to building a coalition, and having allies, stronger allies, and Canada absolutely needs to step up and be a stronger ally. But if we are worried about our trade relationship with the United States collapsing, if we are worried about having to send our oil and gas to other countries in Asia, there's a willing buyer on the other side of the pond. If the United States doesn't want that, if you're putting us into that position, you're caging a cat in the corner, and it may not be pretty. And where I really think specifically it is a problem, Canada can develop some of the critical minerals that we need for those supply chains that China currently is putting restrictions on. We can develop some of that processing capacity. We can process more. It comes at a security premium. We cannot compete with China on cost, so you need to either use some, defense spending money or some other government intervention to close the delta between what, you can purchase in China from what you can get in Canada. This week, it's going to be very hard to build a business case if you're Teck or you're Rio Tinto or you're some mining company to build a processing facility in Canada to sell to the United States. Because if there's going to be 25% tariffs on your commodities, then the security premium now now it's double, where it was a fraction before. And the uncertainty of building anything, any kind of manufacturing capability, including defense, including weapons, where the United States was your biggest market. Right now, what is the business case for that if maybe your product's going to be 25% and they're going to go to countries that don't have a tariff? So the anxiety, I'm fine with pushing us for more defense spending. I have anxiety this week that's going to be a real hard push now to get Canada to develop the components that we need for defense supply chains and to ramp up our military industrial base.
No, I think that's a super important point in the sense that we need to be, and I'm going to get to Johnson on this, the national security premium component. I think it was Lenin or Trotsky who said that the capitalists will sell you the rope to hang them with, and we have been doing that with China. And Xi Jinping, being a good Leninist, had take that and will continue to do so unless we realize that we need to sort of step up and realize that buying shoes is not the same thing as reliant on China for the production of the essentials for our defense and prosperity. And I think that mindset within the government need to come and step up and need to pay attention to the fact that the Chinese are stockpiling everything, like everything, from food to fuel to minerals to rapidly expanding their nuclear forces. They used to have about 250, now they're up to 500 warheads. They aim to get 1,500 warheads by 2035. They might get there earlier. You don't do that if you are reliant on purely defensive purposes and if you're not planning to engage force projection outside your country. So we need to be sort of paying attention, I think, to that significantly and tell this to our American friends, saying that, look, if you really want to be able to face this challenge, you need allies and you can't find a better one than Canada. So we really have to be working here together. Johnson, you have been talking about the national security premium quite a while. How does that link with Trump and what you heard?
Sure. Well, while I wasn't crying in 2016, I recant the story that I was lecturing on. I did a lecture at a university in Asia the day before the election in 2016. And I still remember they said, well, the experts here, and I had all the maps on my PowerPoint about the Electoral College and what was possible. And we all know, like probably many people in this room, we had the prediction wrong. The reason I mention that, though, is that there may have been a viable excuse. So you went into government circles in Tokyo, Berlin, Ottawa, wherever, Brussels. No one really knew. No one predicted this. Very few people predicted this in 2016. So there may have been an excuse to say, okay, we're not prepared on the defense and national security side. We haven't had the time to make the preparations, even though you could argue that you don't need a new president of the United States to force that. There is no excuse this time around. So going back to the idea that being prepared and controlling what you can control, yes, there are a lot of challenging messages, and there's going to be a lot of challenging times ahead dealing with Washington on a number of different files. But this should not come as a surprise to leaders in Ottawa. It should not come to a surprise to leaders overseas. Number one, that he was reelected. and number two, some of the themes that he's focused on. So one of the things that I often say, and I think this is particularly true on China, is that if you're the Chinese side and you were dealing with the Biden administration for the last 4 years, three principles that you're probably somewhat happy to see in a room are the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor. Not to say they're going to be irrelevant in this new Trump administration, but the three principles that you're going to see that have the most power are going to be Treasury, Commerce, and Trade. So basically, it's the economic challenge, it's the economic pushback that you're going to see from this Trump administration that's fundamentally different. The Biden administration talked about these small gardens with high walls, so whether it's on technology or critical minerals, and they did some positive things. But I think you're going to see significant economic headwinds, and that's something Canada and others are just going to have to prepare for. We don't have the readout of all the things that happened at the dinner in Mar-a-Lago, other than us becoming the 51st state. But one of the comments that came that I heard from the initial phone call between Trudeau and Trump this time around, when he congratulated President-elect Trump, was that what came into the conversation? What are you guys doing on China? Economically, in security terms, defense. So going back to this question, Balkan, you were saying about your insurance or the security premium, we have had time. We have had, well before Donald Trump was even elected in 2016, we made commitments to NATO. And something that we say as an institute is that, and I think NATO officials are saying this now too, is the idea of quote unquote 2% and obsessing over 2% of GDP. We're way past that. We were past that in February 2022 with a re-invasion. We should have been past that in 2014 with the actual invasion starting of Ukraine, in addition to the security challenges that we face in the Indo-Pacific, et cetera. One sort of last point too is I think that the failure of imagination for a lot of government officials, and I think Ottawa is very culpable of this too, is not just thinking about what's happening today. So obviously our hearts and our minds are with what's happening in Ukraine, and we think about Taiwan, et cetera. But we still, in our bandwidth and our minds, can't foresee what might happen 2 or 3 years into the future, or 2 or 3 months into the future. So one of the things, as somebody who spent a lot of my time in Asia, is that I think it's very, very possible, whether it's an invasion of Taiwan or whether it's something else, whether it's seizing one of the islands in the South China Sea, which is used as a pretext or a context to then ramp up pressure on Taiwan. We can see multiple things happening at the same time, and we're frankly not prepared. If you walk in, to the Prime Minister's office the day after that happened and said, "Where are our China analysts? Where's our money on defense?" It's too late. Just as it's too late to start talking about border security when a President-elect tweets about it. You have to prepare for these things in advance. So I think this is my main point, is that we have to be very intentional about this, reasserting the point about having the comparative advantage. And this is where I'll end off at, is that we should be spending more on defense. I think there's many ways we can help our allies on this challenge. But thinking about what is it that, number one, our partners and allies want from us, and what is our comparative advantage. And I think going to Heather's point, it's energy security, it's critical minerals, it's ag, it's food. I mean, it's pretty simple in many ways. And this is across the board. This is our key allies in the Asia Pacific, be it Japan and South Korea, our key allies in Europe, Germany. We remember the Chancellor coming here and coming with nothing when he returned back. So we have different strategic benefits that, as a country, that we can provide to our allies that other countries can't. Yes, we're not the United States. We don't have the military might of the United States, but we do have significant resources and capabilities that we can provide to them that adds to deterrence. So I think that's the area that we should be focusing, not only on beefing up our defense spending, but really trying to get that intentional value. Because I say, the two, and I'll end on this, the two core elements to successful diplomacy, and spoiler alert, we don't have successful diplomacy right now, is number one, showing up. Showing up is great. You show up to meetings, engage with counterparts, show up with purpose. What is the purpose? What is it that you have that is helpful to yourself, of course, for your own national interests, but also to the partner you're working with? And I feel if I was to grade us in the last few years, we may get maybe a B+ or an A- on showing up, but we get about a D or a D- on purpose. I mean, we're basically just self-reflecting to a mirror to ourselves on the things we want to hear, rather than actually talking to our partners about what they need. So I'll be quiet now.
No, I mean, bringing something valuable to the table and doing that not only to protect our own security, but also enhance our prosperity while providing meaningful support for the security and prosperity of our allies is something we can do with the resources that we have. And, it's, again, blowing to me that our allies are literally coming and asking, and our reactions when it comes to natural resources, whether it's Germany, Poland, Greece, Korea, Japan, and whoever else, is like, yeah, we don't do that. And why is that, right? So it is, I would say, not an acceptable way of conducting statecraft and putting Canadian interest at the center. And we can actually make a meaningful difference. Rob, over to you. You have highlighted the importance of thinking how both the Russians and the Chinese think about and prepare for a potential conflict. And of course, we know that the deterrence is always a lot cheaper than fighting a war. If you think spending 2% or 3% of your GDP for defense is too much, wait till you do that for 50% because you are in a war. So how do we need to sort of bring this to both the public consciousness, the need to focus on the importance of deterrence, of security, of doing the right thing, and how the new Trump administration, their policies might have an impact on that?
Thank you. Well, the first thing, of course, you said also to respond to I have to make clear, of course, in the defense of disagreeing with Heather on that one point, and this is very important that your sister hear this. Her thesis was so outstanding. It was on Arctic regionalism. It was a very fresh look. Do you think I could convince her to turn it into a book? And, that was always a big regret. So just to make sure that we put it in the proper context. When it comes to thinking, though, seriously about where Canada fits, particularly with the Trump regime, and I use the term regime purposely, is borders. Trump is, of course, fixated on borders. The big fear is that he is going to become, and we go back to our history, we think of the Americans becoming isolationist, and we think, okay, in terms of tariff, in terms of the Mexican border, in terms of security, it's about borders. Okay, fine. So the other factor that we have to bring into account is a lot of people said, oh, well, you didn't really have to worry about Trump too much, because remember, in 2016 to 2020, he didn't actually do everything that he said he could do. But remember that he was totally shocked that he won. In other words, one of the things that we know is that he was not prepared to actually take power. He was expecting to lose, and so therefore had not really thought through. Well, this time there is no question whatsoever that not only was he thinking that he was going to win, but he prepared to win. So in other words, I think that we have to take what he says much more serious, and he says borders. Where does that come to Canada and the Arctic? Well, of course, we're already seeing the Premier saying we have to spend more on defense because we have to pick up the defense of our southern border. But in my mind, the critical point is going to be the Canadian-American relationship in terms of the northern border. Now, again, this is where I get frustrated when I hear people saying, well, we need a seat at a table or we need to meet 2%. I say that misses the point. We need to secure Canadians and North Americans. And I come back to the point in terms of when we look at the forced posture of the Russians, again, for their perspective of how the new deterrent system is working, look at their delivery systems. They're investing in the traditional deterrent systems. They've got new ICBMs, they got new SLBMs, but they also have the new hypersonics. They've got the new cruise guide missiles. These are all meant to actually disrupt deterrence. This is what General Van Herk, when he was the general in charge of NORAD and NORTHCOM, said terrified him the most. You don't get warning. You don't get defense against the developing Chinese and Russian systems. And so therefore, to talk about 2% or a place at the table, I think it misses the point. We need to be talking about how do you truly defend Canadians? And the major way that you defend Canadians is make sure deterrence is maintained. Make sure that the Chinese and the Russians both understand their new delivery systems will not allow them to launch that decapitation strike. And that's what people are talking about. They're not talking about sort of like a vision of an all-out nuclear strike. They're talking about a situation where the Chinese and the Russians can come to some common agreement on an overall strategy, and they want to cripple the Americans for a short period of time. And so you launch that hypersonics, because then you say, you know, and then the Chinese and Russians, if they launch that, take out Washington, take out the decision making that then allows them to seize either Poland, the Balkans, whatever the limited amounts that the Russians want, and for the Chinese it's Taiwan, because then the pressure is put back. If they can succeed in that, then they say, okay, United States, are you truly going to launch a full blast nuclear strike on us? And as Balkan pointed out, the Chinese are in a massive rearmament of their nuclear capability. They're going up to 300. The American DoD just released a report that says they are expecting by the end of the decade for them to be up to 5,000 weapons. That's equivalent to the Americans. And so you're doing that for war fighting and deterrence. And so I come back to the point. In order to give Canadians true security, we have to ensure that the borders to the north are defendable, are in fact incapable of having a successful Chinese or Russian strike. And that means, and this is the kicker, if you look at Canadian policy, even go within this current government, if you look at strong, secure, engaged, they kind of got it. They said, okay, we have to do NORAD modernization. Did we do anything? No, of course not. And this is the problem. The Americans are going to see that. The Americans are going to say, okay, you are the weak point. Now, the problem I see with Trump is what happens when a Trump looks at Canada and says, you are going to allow the Russians or Chinese to actually try to use tactical nuclear war against us? It's your fault? Can you imagine what type of retributions the Americans will bring against us? Again, you see the centrality in my argument about the Arctic. So this is why right now you see the government somewhat panically trying to say, okay, no, we really meant what we said we were going to do in 2017, and we're going to do it all right now. But the problem is, again, is political will. And I'll end on this point. Everybody always says to me, well, Rob, you know, we're a small nation. We can never do this. We can never turn on the dime. How many billions is the government paying to give most of you $250? Again, put together the overall political will of the overall expenditure that has to come in terms of the Klein dollar version. Well, I guess it's the Trudeau dollars now instead of Klein. But again, think in terms of the total amount of money that the government could get, political agreement from the NDP, and they did it. You know, so any argumentation that we can't do it, that we're Canadians, we can't turn on a dime like that, I just say BS. It's about political will. And it's about the borders, and it's about the protection of Canada.
And I mean, never mind the $25 billion in EV subsidies to the richest companies in the world, you know. So if there's a will, there's a way. I will turn out to the audience for questions, but just want to add one last thing to Rob's point. The central bargain, the understanding of NATO, but also more broadly, the security architecture after the Second World War, was that North America, US and Canada, remains a safe haven in which its resources can be marshaled to meet a threat that emerges in Eurasia. That requires the protection of the North American homeland, and so that you can actually marshal and send those resources to meet that particular threat. So the first thing an enemy would do, be it Russia, Soviet Union, Russia today, China tomorrow, is to cripple that ability to bring the resources and the might of North America, US and Canada, to bear on a conflict in Eurasia. And how you do that? You do that by engaging in strikes. You do that by cyber attacks to the critical infrastructure in North America, to the electricity grid, to the pipelines, to everything else. And given how we are connected with the United States on this notion, it is very naive to assume that we are going to remain outside, that our geography would somehow prevent us. No, we will be one of the first targets if and when this happens. So I think it is important to understand that.